My name is Ais Abdullah Ali, and I'm also known as Clevin Raphael Holt. I would call myself a professional soldier of Islam. It was an inspiration that was sent to me by way of God, through his angels.
There was a point where he was angry. He was angry you couldn't reach him.
It was a sensation inside of me that was so strong that I just couldn't ignore it.
He's the ultimate insider. He speaks perfect English. He's been in the military. He's got the uniforms. He's got the American passport.
Bottom line was he wanted to die.
He was wanted in the United States for questioning the terrorist activities.
I don't hate Jews, I don't hate Christians, I don't hate Muslims, I don't hate any person. I just hate the sick, the mad, the ill that comes out of us all, even myself. So that's what I'm at war with, even myself.
When he talks about what motivates him, what makes him tick, where he came from, what he's willing to do, it's wise to listen to him.
Smith, and this is Kenneth Wallace, Ava Stella's husband, and there's Wolf Gwendon.
Our refusal to register for the draft found resonance among quite a few people.
But there were others that were saying, you know, if you don't love it, leave it. As though the only way to build communities, to build countries, to build a better world is to be willing to kill somebody. That was why they had looked for someplace outside the States and settled on Costa Rica, because of the fact that it was a peace-loving country.
And if you just think about that, think of a group of foreigners going into another country and starting a community. That's pretty tricky.
I feel a strong sense of connection with the story of the original group that came down here, their choices and their courage in making pretty dramatic changes in their lives for the sake of conscience.
It was important to make a statement about our feelings against militarism.
These discs were hovering off the floor without any visible means of support. They were referred to as alien reproduction vehicles, also nicknamed the flux liner because they used high voltage electricity. This is a diagram that I made based on a sketch that Brad Sorensen did for me in rough form and subsequently cleaned that drawing up and made it much more accurate.
He said, you know, Mark, he says, this drawing is about as accurate as you can get. He says, every detail, every aspect of it is right on the money. He said, it is so accurate in every way. He says, this has to be probably one of the most dangerous illustrations you've ever done in your life. And he says, and if you're smart, he says, you'll tear up the original, you'll throw it away, and you'll never talk about it again.
When it was all done, the CIA, one of the CIA men told the people they were now sworn to secrecy that this meeting never happened and this event never happened.
You don't write anything down, and you keep it to yourself. It's a need-to-know basis only.
Well, I thought, gee, this is something that we have to keep quiet.
The European Union has imposed fresh sanctions on Syria's President Bashar al-Assad because of his government's continuing crackdown on anti-government protesters, in which more than 900 people have reportedly been killed. The 27-nation bloc has instituted an asset freeze and a visa ban on Assad and 9 other members of his regime. And in another development tonight, US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's called on Syria to end the killings.
In adding President Bashar al-Assad and others to the list of those already affected by EU sanctions Monday, EU foreign ministers said they wanted to send a clear message that the repression and killing in the country is not going unnoticed.
The repression in Syria continues, and it is important to see the right to peaceful protest, the release of political prisoners, and taking the path of reform, not repression, in Syria.
Dem syrischen Präsidenten Assad.
There was a bridge built for Syrian President Assad so that he himself wouldn't be affected by sanctions if he returned to dialogue and ended the repression against his own people. He chose not to get on that bridge.
Human rights groups estimate that more than 700 civilians have been killed by security forces during nearly 2 months of popular protests. The demonstrations have spread from southern Syria to towns across the country. Syrian authorities have blamed most of the violence on armed groups backed by Islamists and foreign powers. The government says those groups have killed more than 120 members of the security forces. Syria's foreign minister Walid al-Muallim said that EU sanctions will hurt European interests as much as Syria's. Meanwhile, demonstrations continued across the country, calling on the government to step down.
Afghan authorities denounce a new blunder by NATO. Officials say a coalition airstrike in the south of the country has left 12 civilians dead. President Hamid Karzai condemned the strike and called this his last warning to Washington. NATO has sent an assessment team to the area to investigate. Just a word of warning, some of our viewers might find the following pictures disturbing.
This is where the campaign for hearts and minds meets the hard realities of war. Tens of thousands of civilians have been killed in Afghanistan, most in combat operations between opposing sides. But an all too significant number have been the result of Allied airstrikes. And because they create dramatic body counts among innocents, they undermine support for the cause. It's long been a major source of friction between Afghanistan and its Western allies.
The Afghan people are allies of the United States. The Afghan people want this effort together to succeed. But Afghan people also want to have their children safe. The Afghan people say we are fighting together with you, shoulder to shoulder against terrorism. It's an important thing that America recognize that civilian casualties are the biggest concern in Afghanistan and a damage to the effort.
But this week's attacks gone wrong have brought things to a head. On Saturday, President Karzai ordered his defense minister to take control of night raids, Allied airstrikes carried out in darkness on suspected insurgent hideouts. They've often been blamed for civilian deaths. One reason is demographics. During the Soviet era, military sites were located in densely populated areas to protect them from insurgents. That trend has continued. Another is rapidly changing realities on the battlefield.
Find out what they're shooting at!
In a friendly fire incident last week, an airstrike was called in on an insurgent position that had already been overrun by police. NATO has sent a task force, including Afghanis, to investigate the incidents of the past week. Whatever the outcome, it's clear the continued killing of civilians, accidental or otherwise, is sorely testing Afghan sympathies.
The president of Syria is set to address the nation for the first time since unprecedented protests broke out 2 weeks ago. Those rallies have become more and more violent, and Bashar al-Assad will have to tread a fine line between introducing reform and keeping his grip on power.
It's Assad's make-or-break moment. It will be the first time he's spoken since a wave of demonstrations against his authoritarian rule have swept the country. And it comes a day after the government resigned.
We have just received the following. President Bashar al-Assad accepts the resignation of Mohamed Naji al-Atri, the current prime minister.
It was a rare concession in a country unused to responding to public pressure. And it hints at a deeper struggle between a man who began his career as a potential reformer and the powerful inner circle that surrounds him. In his address to the nation, President Bashar al-Assad must tread a fine line. He has to find a way to appease demonstrators' demands for a more open system while trying to cling to power. He's already dismissed the governor in Dara, where government forces fired on demonstrators. If he lifts the 48-year-old state of emergency that restricts civil and political freedoms, the streets may swell with demonstrators. If he attempts to diminish the power of the dreaded security services, he may himself fall. Assad came to power 11 years ago amid hopes of reform, but his efforts were thwarted by entrenched power, and the so-called Damascus Spring never materialized. For Syrians filling the streets across the country, the time is now.
From fashion to cars now, and the Swedish brand Saab has been given a new lease of life. Manufacturing at its only factory in Sweden has been shut down for weeks because of a lack of money. Now, though, Saab's Dutch owner Spyker says it's struck up a deal with a Chinese car maker to pump in 150 million euros.
The Dutch boutique car maker was quick to stress that the deal with Houtai was a partnership and not an acquisition. And Spyker was breathing a sigh of relief after Saab's production shut down in early April due to a lack of working capital. Spyker chief Victor Muller said the deal will provide the company with a much-needed injection of cash to restart operations, as well as a strategic foothold in the Chinese market.
There are so many positives that you could think of. It clearly engages in the manufacturing of Saabs in China, the distribution of Saabs in China, also transfer of technology.
Houtai is relatively new to the auto market and has teamed up with Hyundai to tap China's fast-growing SUV sector. It says its partnership with Spyker will give it access to new technologies and Saab's global network.
We have our advantages and they have theirs. Two big corporations have come together, and the secret is that we're very complementary.
GM offloaded Saab to Spyker in January 2010 for $500 million. But the Dutch company with 110 employees specializing in handmade sports cars ran into cash flow problems trying to run a company that produced nearly 100,000 cars a year. The deal means that Sweden's two big car makers, both previously owned by U.S. companies, are now in Chinese hands. Last year, Ford Motor Company sold Volvo to China's Geely for $1.5 billion.
Now we go to the Ivory Coast, where the forces of Alassane Ouattara continue to stream into Abidjan. It's been a constant stream, with fighters arriving to take part in what they're calling the final battle. The city has been rocked by explosions and gunfire as Laurent Gbagbo's forces have continued to try to hold areas outside the city. Ouattara's spokesman has told France 24 that Gbagbo's residence has been captured, although his whereabouts remain unclear. The UN has also become involved, targeting military camps and sites near the presidential palace, where rocket launchers are based. It's all in response to what the UN says has become a sustained attack by the forces of Laurent Gbagbo against the people of Abidjan and the UN base there. The UN's peacekeeping chief, Alain Leroy, said the base had come under almost continuous attack for 3 days and that he himself had been forced to hide with his staff in the basement because of mortar attacks.
The United Nations confirmed Monday that it was using attack helicopters to strike troops and heavy weapons bases in Abidjan, belonging to incumbent President Laurent Gbagbo. French helicopters played a support role in the operation, which targeted military barracks where rocket launchers, mortars, artillery, and armored vehicles were stored. Laurent Gbagbo's private residence was also targeted. The attacks represent an unprecedented escalation in the international community's involvement in efforts to oust the entrenched leader.
So the resolution is very clear. The Paragraph 6 gives us the mandate to prevent the use of heavy weapons against the civilian population.
But Gbagbo's camp decried the attacks.
We strongly condemn these acts of war by France, the United States and the United Nations. These acts are unacceptable and unjustifiable.
The attacks came as forces loyal to Alassane Ouattara entered Abidjan for the final push to oust Gbagbo. Heavy clashes were reported throughout the city. In the evening, Ouattara's forces announced they'd surrounded Gbagbo's residence and were waiting to see if he would surrender. A Ouattara advisor said that Gbagbo was believed to be holed up in a bunker inside his residence, but his actual whereabouts were unknown. Ouattara has asked that his rival not be harmed.
Well, France and the United States have repeated their calls for Gbagbo to step aside, saying he'll be held responsible for any violence. A look now at what might come next for him.
It's a classic case of checkmate. Condemned by the international community, abandoned by his military chief, his police force and the gendarmes, Laurent Gbagbo's power base has quickly shrunk down to a small holdout in Abidjan. And the question on everyone's mind is, what's his exit strategy?
If, in fact, there is major violence in Abidjan and Gbagbo does not step aside, he and those around him, including his wife, Simone Gbagbo, will have to be held accountable for the actions that they failed to take.
Essentially, Gbagbo has three options: surrender, flee, or die fighting. Representatives of the internationally recognized Ivorian government of Alassane Ouattara hope Gbagbo chooses the first option, to avoid a bloodbath.
Although we have faced difficulties, he would never accept that we endanger Laurent Gbagbo physically. So he can surrender. So that his supporters do not put up a desperate fight.
Gbagbo's already refused exile in South Africa, where he could be exposed to international prosecution. But Angola is a possibility. Gbagbo has been stockpiling money there. And President José Eduardo dos Santos, in power since 1979, still owes Gbagbo for destroying rebel bases on Ivorian territory during Angola's civil war. Ivorian Prime Minister Guillaume Soro warned that whatever option Gbagbo chooses, the fight will be over soon.
Still a lot of money there being frozen by the Swiss. An interesting development, something we perhaps wouldn't have seen 10 or 20 years ago. These people, of course, Swiss bank accounts known usually for being bulletproof, but there are cases, it seems, where the Swiss will take action. They won't just do business with anyone these days, it seems.
And with Swiss bank accounts no longer the safe havens they used to be for ill-gotten gains, how did Osama bin Laden finance al-Qaeda? It turns out that, in recent years at least, the organisation has learned a few lessons from an unexpected quarter, the burger giant McDonald's. Jodie Jenkins explains.
Al-Qaeda today operates much more like a McDonald's franchising operation than the traditional top-down corporation it once was. The reason is money. At the time of the World Trade Center attacks, Osama bin Laden was believed to be worth approximately $250 million. The CIA estimated that al-Qaeda was running on a $30 million annual budget. Gauging from the gradually diminishing scale of attacks since then, intelligence sources believe that money has begun to dry up. The underwear bomber is one example. Since 9/11, the U.S. Treasury has made a concerted effort to shut off traditional avenues of funding and moving money, making it more difficult for terrorist organizations to get the funding they need to where they need it. One of the biggest breakthroughs has been Saudi cooperation. The Saudi government has joined international efforts to choke off the flow of money from wealthy Saudi contributors and others. It has begun arresting financiers, freezing assets, and surveilling charitable organizations that have been avenues for diverting funds. So that today, al-Qaeda has a money crunch. And while it still has franchises such as al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they are largely on their own when it comes to raising money to bribe officials, pay fighters, and fund attacks. And like al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, they're increasingly turning to crimes such as kidnapping to fund their operations.